This video is going to focus on how to work the heel flap, the heel turn, and shaping the gusset for socks worked 2 at a time. I've started out by knitting the cuffs and my legs of my sock using the magic loop method, and we're going to continue in this method working the heels. Each pattern that you work your socks from is going to have a slightly different technique on creating your heel flap. The pattern that I'm working from has you complete a round in its entirety before beginning the heel flap. I can tell I've completed my round because my working yarn and my cast on tail are at the same end. And the way that I work heel flaps on 2 at a time is actually with the I guess I should say I knit up the back of the sock. So our heel flap is going to be formed vertically from this point over 2 socks. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to consider this sock 1 and this sock 2, and we're going to work both heel flaps at the same time. So in order to start, I'm going to move this extra skein out of the way. I'm going to pull the needle closest to me out as if I was working in the round, except it's the opposite of what we would typically do. Normally we would pull the back needle out and work across the front. However, to create a heel flap, we need to work flat back and forth across this back needle. So my instructions simply say to start by slipping that first stitch purlwise and then purling to the end of the row. So I'm going to purl across this row and come back and show you the next step. Okay, so I have purled across the back of sock 1. My working yarn is attached to the left side. And now I need to purl across the back of sock 2. So much like when we worked across back 1, we're going to follow the same instructions, working off of a different ball of yarn, right? We're keeping our yarn separate. And I'm simply going to slip 1 and purl across this row. Okay, so I have completed knitting across the back of sock 1 and across the back of sock 2. To continue working across the heel flap, I need to turn my work so that the back of the sock is facing me. And starting with the working yarn attached to sock 2, we're going to work in pattern across the back of the heel flap. In my case, my pattern says to slip 1, purlwise, knit 1, repeat across. So we're going to slip 1 and knit 1, repeating across. And I'm going to do the same both across the back of sock 2 and across the back of sock 1. And you're going to repeat those 2 rows of purling across one side and then working in pattern across the other alternately between sock 1 and sock 2 until you have a heel flap for both socks. So here I've finished the heel flaps for both socks, and now we need to start turning the heels. However, in order to be able to start working in the round and picking up our stitches in the correct order, we have to change up our order of operation a little bit so that our working yarns will be in the correct place to pick up our stitches. So to get going, what we need to do first is move all of the stitches from sock 1 onto a separate needle so we can work the heel turn of sock 2 in its entirety and pick up some edge stitches before we work on turning the heel of sock 1. Okay, so I now have my stitches separated onto 2 different needles. The stitches from heel flap on sock 1 are on the right hand needle, and the stitches from the heel flap on sock 2 are on the left needle. But per our instructions to turn the heel, I'm just going to move these stitches out of the way. So we're essentially working what feels like 1 at a time. We're going to slip the first stitch and purl across the required number of stitches. Okay, so I have purled across the required number of stitches. I'm now going to purl 2 stitches together and purl 1. And here's the short row. We have not worked all the way to the end of the stitches on our needle. We're now going to turn the work so the right side of the heel is facing us. And in order to get that working yarn onto our right hand needle, we're going to slip that first stitch purlwise from the right or left to right needle and then knit. And my pattern says to knit 3. And then we're going to work an SSK followed by a K1. What that does is divide our sock heel, or our sock heel flap I should say, into 3 sections. You'll see you've got some stitches on the right and then a gap. We've got our center stitches, which is going to form the bottom of the cup or the heel turn, and then a section of stitches on the left hand. At this point, the number of stitches on either side of center should be even. So we're going to continue working in this method of purling on the wrong side and knitting on the right side, decreasing by 1 stitch each time we get to the gap. So your instructions will say to knit to 1 stitch, or pardon me, purl to 1 stitch before the gap. And here's your gap. You can see there's quite a space between the right hand stitch and the left hand stitch. That's where we turned our work. We're going to purl across the gap by inserting our right hand needle into the right hand stitch and the left hand stitch and purling them together, and then working a purl 1. And we're going to turn our work, slip that first stitch purlwise to get the working yarn on our right hand needle, going to knit to 1 stitch before the gap and work an SSK, or a slip slip knit, across the gap. So we're going to slip the first stitch knitwise, second stitch knitwise, and knit those 2 stitches through the back loop and work a knit 1. And you can already see that there's a bit of a cup that's starting to form. That will form the bottom of our heel. So I'm going to continue working the heel flap, or pardon me, the heel turn across here, and then I'm going to show you how to pick up stitches to start working in the round again. So I've now completed working the heel turn for sock number 2. You can see it creates this triangular shape, and that's what cups the bottom of your foot when you put your sock on. You'll also notice that it has fewer stitches on it. When we worked the short rows, we decreased by 1 stitch on each edge as we worked to the edge of our rows. So there are now fewer stitches on the heel flap than there are on the instep. So in order to get our working yarn into position back here to start working on the instep stitches of our sock again, we need to pick up stitches along the edge of our heel flap. So I'm going to move this sock 1 out of the way again, and I'm going to pick up sock 2 and turn it so that the right side, or the outside of the sock, is facing us. Pick up and knit 1 stitch into each of the slipped edge stitches that we created when we were working the heel flap. I caution you not to pick up this very first V that is currently attached to the working yarn on our needle. Starting above that stitch, insert your right needle under both legs of that V and knit it. This creates a new stitch and will allow us to start working in the round by picking up a stitch along the edge here. Okay, so I have picked up and knit 1 stitch into each slipped edge stitch along the edge of my heel flap. We've got a set of vertical V's that run underneath the stitch attached to our front needle, and we have the same thing coming from the right needle that's attached to the edge of the sock. You'll see a column of V's. What we're going to do is, actually, I'm going to use the needle tip that's attached to sock 1 just to help me pick the stitches up. We want to pick up the right hand leg of the stitch 2 stitches above that on the needle, and the left leg of the stitch immediately adjacent to it on the column attached to the heel flap. So you're going to have what looks like 2 legs sitting on your needle. We're now going to knit those as if they are a K2 tog. What that does is just pulls the edge of the stitches a little bit closer at the top so that when we're ready to start working in the round again, we don't have a hole. What we now need to do with sock 1 is repeat the method of working the heel flap on the bottom of sock 1 and pick up the stitches on sock 1. And much like when we prepared to work sock 2, we need to move our stitches back into place so that our working yarn is in the correct position. If I turn my socks back into the position from the beginning of the video, where we had, of course, there's yarn all over the place, but we have the heel flap, heel turn, and half the gusset picked up for sock 2, and the heel flap of sock 1 completed. So we're going to work the heel turn and pick up these edge stitches. And when I've done that, I'm going to come back and show you the remaining steps for picking up all of our stitches and getting everything back in the round. So now that I've completed the heel turn and pick up the edge stitches of the right side of the heel flap for both sock 1 and sock 2, we're almost back to working entirely in the round. We still need to work across the instep of sock 1, and we will drop our working yarn. We need to work across the instep of sock 2 and pick up these edge stitches. I've knit across the front of sock 1 and sock 2 and now need to pick up these edge stitches. We're going to do the same technique of picking up that extra stitch in the corner here before we pick up our heel flap stitches. We're going to pick up the right leg of the V below the heel flap column. We want to be 2 stitches below the stitch on the needle. Hopefully that makes sense. You've got 1 stitch on the needle, 1 stitch below it, and then you want to pick up the left leg of the stitch below that. We're going to knit those stitches together like a K2 tog, and this is our extra stitch that we've picked up to close the gap. Now, much like when we worked up the edge on the other side of the heel flap, into each of these slipped stitch V's, we're going to pick up and knit 1 stitch. All right, so I've now picked up my edge stitches along the left side of my heel flap. I'm going to knit across the bottom of the heel and then all the way up the side of the right side of the heel flap, at which point we're going to drop our working yarn for sock 2 and pick up our working yarn for sock 1 so we can finally pick up these remaining stitches along the edge of this heel flap. Once I've picked up those stitches, I'm going to knit all the way around to the end of the needle. Okay, so after all of those steps, we are finally back to working in the round. Our front needle houses all of our instep stitches for sock 1 and sock 2. And our back needle, which you can see is doing quite a little roller coaster here, holds all of the stitches for our heels and gussets. So when you go back to your instructions, it's going to tell you to work across the insteps independently with no decreases. Everything's simply going to be knitting even like we did for the leg. And the gusset is going to have decreases worked after the very first stitch on your needle and right before the last stitch on your sock. So thank you for participating in the 2 at a time gusset heel video tutorial. I know it's a lot of steps, but it's a great method to knit socks 2 at a time with a gusset heel, which really, in my opinion, is the best fitting heel.